When an elderly couple lost everything and moved into an abandoned ranger shelter deep in the Oregon wilderness, they thought they were just trying to survive another winter. But beneath the rotting floorboards of that forgotten station, locked behind a vault even the government had erased from its records, they discovered $245 million and a secret that would expose the biggest cover-up in modern history. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The rain hammered against the windows of the 1987 Buick station wagon like 1,000 tiny fists demanding entry. Each drop seemed to carry its own accusation, its own reminder of how far they'd fallen. Inside the car, Martin Crawford sat hunched in the driver's seat, his 71-year-old frame folded uncomfortably around the steering wheel, staring out at nothing. His hands, weathered and scarred from 40 years of factory work, trembled, not from the cold seeping through the cracked weather stripping, but from something deeper. Exhaustion, despair. The bone-deep weariness of a man who'd done everything right and still ended up with nothing. In the passenger seat, Ruth Crawford pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her thin shoulders. At 73, she'd survived cancer, raised 2 children, and weathered every storm life had thrown at them. But this existence in the cramped confines of a dying car was testing her in ways she'd never imagined. She pressed her face against Martin's shoulder, feeling the dampness of his flannel shirt, smelling the mix of old sweat and the cheap soap from the truck stop bathroom they'd used that morning. She tried not to cry. She'd promised herself she wouldn't cry again. But promises were hard to keep when your stomach was empty and the cold made your joints ache like they were filled with broken glass. This was their home now, had been for 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Not that Martin was counting, except he was. Every single day felt like a year, every night like an eternity. They'd been living in this car, moving from parking lot to parking lot, Walmart to Walmart, rest stop to rest stop, anywhere they could park for a few hours without being rousted by security or police telling them to move along. Always moving along, never welcome, never safe. It hadn't always been like this. That was the cruelest part. They'd had a life once, a real life. Martin had worked at the Cascade manufacturing plant for 34 years, building industrial equipment, honest work with honest pay. They'd owned a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood where kids still rode bikes and neighbors still waved. Ruth had worked part-time at the library until her 60s, then retired to tend her garden and volunteer at the community center. They'd saved carefully, never spending beyond their means, building a nest egg that was supposed to carry them through their golden years. Golden years. Martin almost laughed at the phrase now. More like rusted-out years, tarnished years, years that had corroded faster than the undercarriage of this old Buick. The collapse had started 3 years ago with a single word: cancer. Ruth had felt the lump herself during a shower, had known immediately that something was wrong. The diagnosis came back fast and brutal. Stage 3 breast cancer, aggressive, requiring immediate treatment, surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, the whole nightmare cocktail of modern medicine fighting to save her life. And it worked. Thank God, it worked. The cancer went into remission. Ruth survived. But survival came with a price tag that middle-class Americans couldn't afford. Even with Medicare and supplemental insurance, the out-of-pocket costs had been staggering. Co-pays for specialists, deductibles that reset every year. Experimental treatments insurance wouldn't cover, medications that cost $300 a month. The bills came in waves, each one higher than the last until they were drowning in medical debt. $78,000, that's what survival had cost them. $78,000 they didn't have. They'd burned through their savings in the first year, wiped out their retirement accounts in the second, started missing mortgage payments in the third. Martin had begged the bank for extensions, for modifications, for anything. He'd explained Ruth's illness, shown them the medical bills, pleaded for mercy. The bank had been very sorry, very understanding, and entirely inflexible. The foreclosure notice came on a Tuesday. They had 90 days to vacate. Martin had tried everything to save the house. He'd looked for work, but who wanted to hire a 70-year-old former factory worker when younger men were desperate for the same jobs? He'd applied for assistance programs, only to be told they made too much from Social Security to qualify. Too much. They were losing their home, but apparently they made too much. He'd even swallowed his pride and called their daughter Melissa, who lived in Seattle with her software engineer husband and 2 perfect children in their perfect house. The conversation still burned in his memory. "Dad, we'd love to help, but things are really tight right now," Melissa had said, her voice carrying that carefully practiced tone of regret that rich people used when they didn't want to share. "Brandon's got his student loans, and the kids' private school is so expensive, and we're trying to save for a bigger house. Maybe you and Mom could look into some government programs." Government programs. As if they hadn't tried. As if they were stupid. Their son, Kyle, hadn't even pretended to care. He'd stopped calling years ago, disappeared into his own life in California, nursing grudges about a childhood that hadn't been perfect enough. Martin had tried reaching out when they lost the house. The number was disconnected. Kyle had moved on, and apparently parents weren't worth forwarding addresses. So they'd packed what they could fit into the Buick, donated or abandoned everything else, and drove away from the only home they'd known for 27 years. Just drove away, watching it disappear in the rearview mirror like a dream they'd only imagined having. The first weeks in the car had been the hardest. They'd told themselves it was temporary, just until they figured something out, just until Martin found work or they got approved for housing assistance or some miracle happened. But miracles didn't come. The shelter system was overwhelmed, with waiting lists months long. The cheap motels ate through what little money they had. And sleeping in the car, sleeping in the car was harder than either of them had imagined. The seats didn't recline far enough. The cold seeped in through every gap. Every bump and pothole became a jolt of pain in their arthritic joints. They'd tried sleeping in the back with the seats folded down, but there wasn't enough room for both of them to stretch out. Martin usually ended up in the driver's seat, dozing upright, waking every hour with his neck cramping and his back screaming. Ruth managed better in the passenger seat with a pillow wedged against the window, but she rarely slept more than a few hours before the discomfort woke her. They ate once a day, maybe twice if they could afford it. Dollar menu items, day-old bread, whatever was cheapest. Martin had lost 23 pounds in 4 months. Ruth's clothes hung off her like they belonged to someone else. They used truck stop bathrooms to wash up, brushing their teeth at gas station sinks, trying to maintain some shred of dignity while other travelers averted their eyes and walked a little faster past the old people who so obviously didn't belong. The worst part wasn't the hunger or the cold or the constant ache in his bones. The worst part was the invisibility. People looked through them now. They'd become ghosts. The kind of people society had decided to stop seeing. When they sat on a bench outside a grocery store, security guards watched them like they were criminals. When they tried to rest in a park, someone called the police. They weren't people anymore. They were problems, eyesores, reminders of what could happen to anyone who got unlucky. "Martin," Ruth whispered now, pulling him back from his dark thoughts. Her voice was hoarse from the dampness that had settled in her lungs weeks ago. She needed antibiotics, but antibiotics cost money they didn't have. "We can't keep doing this. Winter's coming." He knew. God, he knew. It was late October now, and the temperature was already dropping into the 30s at night. Soon it would be freezing. The car's heater barely worked, burning through gas they couldn't afford to keep them marginally warm. Another month of this, maybe 2, and they'd freeze. Or Ruth's cough would turn into pneumonia, and that would be the end. After surviving cancer, after fighting so hard to live, she'd die in a parking lot because they couldn't afford a roof over their heads. "I've been thinking," Martin said slowly, his voice rough from disuse. They didn't talk much anymore, both of them too tired, too defeated. But this idea had been growing in his mind for days. "Remember that old ranger station, the one we used to pass when we'd go hiking up near Silver Falls?" Ruth pulled back to look at him, her face gaunt in the dim light from the parking lot security lights. "Martin, that was 30 years ago when we were young, when we had our camping gear and our hiking boots and—" her voice caught. "When we had a home to come back to." "I know," he said, "but I was at the library last week, using their computer." The library was one of the few places they could spend time without being hassled, one of the last refuges for people like them. "I was searching for anything, any kind of housing assistance, and I stumbled across this article about abandoned Forest Service buildings. There's dozens of them scattered through the mountains. Old ranger stations, fire lookouts, maintenance sheds. They were decommissioned in the 90s during budget cuts, and most of them are just sitting there, rotting, empty." "You want us to squat in an abandoned government building," Ruth said flatly. "I want us to survive," Martin replied, meeting her eyes. "Ruth, we're not going to make it another month like this. Your cough is getting worse. My hands shake so bad I can barely hold a cup of coffee. We're 70 years old and we're sleeping in a car. What do we have to lose?" Ruth was quiet for a long time, listening to the rain pound the roof. What did they have to lose? Their dignity? That was already gone. Their self-respect. Hard to respect yourself when you were washing your hair in a gas station sink. Their freedom. They were trapped in this car, in this life, in this slow death. "Is it still there?" she asked finally. "The ranger station?" "I don't know," Martin admitted. "But I remember the general area, that old logging road off Highway 22. If the building's still standing, even if it's in rough shape, it's got to be better than this." Ruth looked around the car's interior, at the garbage bags full of their remaining possessions, at the blankets that smelled like mildew, at the life they'd been reduced to. Then she looked at Martin, at the man she'd been married to for 51 years, who'd worked his fingers to the bone to provide for their family, who'd never asked for anything except a fair shake. A man who deserved so much better than this. "Okay," she said, "let's go look." 3 days later, after scraping together enough money for gas, they made the drive. Martin navigated the old highways he remembered from decades ago, each mile taking them further from civilization and deeper into the Cascade Wilderness. The mountains rose around them, covered in dense forest that seemed to swallow the light. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. All this natural splendor while they lived like animals. The turnoff was harder to find than Martin remembered. The old logging road had been absorbed by the forest, barely visible behind a wall of blackberry bushes and young alders. Martin turned onto it carefully, the Buick's suspension groaning as they navigated ruts and rocks. Branches scraped the sides of the car like fingernails. They drove for 20 minutes, climbing steadily, until Ruth grabbed his arm. "There," she breathed. Through a gap in the trees, they caught their first glimpse. The ranger station sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering Douglas firs that blocked out most of the sky. It was a simple structure, maybe 30 feet by 20 feet, built from weathered timber and river stone. The roof was steeply pitched, covered in moss and missing shingles in places. The windows were intact but filthy. The front porch sagged on one side and the wooden steps looked ready to collapse. But it was standing. After decades of abandonment, it was still standing. Martin parked and they sat for a moment, neither quite believing what they were seeing. Then Martin opened his door and stepped out onto solid ground for the first time in hours. His knees buckled slightly, protesting the movement, but he steadied himself against the car. Ruth joined him, and together they approached the building like pilgrims approaching a shrine. The front door hung crooked on rusty hinges, the wood swollen with moisture. Martin pushed it gently, half expecting it to fall apart in his hands. It groaned in protest but swung open, revealing darkness inside. The smell hit them first: mildew, rot, mouse droppings, decades of neglect. But underneath that, something else. The scent of old wood and stone, of permanence. Martin pulled out the small flashlight he kept in his pocket and swept the beam across the interior. One large room dominated the space, maybe 20 by 15 feet. A massive stone fireplace took up most of one wall, its chimney disappearing up through the roof. The hearth was filled with debris, leaves, twigs, what looked like an old bird's nest, but the structure itself appeared sound. Along another wall, built-in shelves sagged under layers of dust. The floor was hardwood, warped and stained, but mostly intact. A doorway led to a smaller room, perhaps 10 by 10, that had probably served as sleeping quarters. The window in there was cracked, but not shattered. Against one wall, someone had built a simple wooden platform that might have once held a bed. Martin walked the perimeter slowly, testing floorboards, examining walls, running his hands over joints and beams. His factory training kicked in, the ability to assess structure and integrity. The timber frame was solid, built by craftsmen who knew their trade. The roof had holes, yes, but they were small and fixable. The foundation was river stone and concrete, still strong after all these years. Water damage was minimal. The slope of the land drained away from the building. "It's sound," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "The bones are good." Ruth stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, looking smaller and more fragile than he'd ever seen her. "It's a wreck, Martin." "It's shelter," he corrected. "It's 4 walls and a roof. It's more than we have." She walked inside slowly, her footsteps careful on the uneven floor. She approached the fireplace and knelt, peering up the chimney. "The flue's open. We could actually have a fire." "There's firewood everywhere," Martin said, gesturing to the forest outside. "Enough to keep us warm all winter." Ruth moved to the window and rubbed a circle in the grime, looking out at the clearing. "No one's been here in years. Maybe decades." "Exactly," Martin said. "Which means no one's coming back." They explored more thoroughly, finding mouse nests in the corners, evidence of raccoons in the smaller room, water stains on the ceiling where rain had leaked through. But there were also discoveries that gave them hope. A metal water tank outside that could collect rainwater, an old hand pump that might still work with some maintenance, even a small shed behind the building that housed rusty tools and what looked like an ancient chainsaw. As the afternoon light began to fade, Martin and Ruth stood outside the station, looking at what might become their new home. It was illegal. Squatting on federal land could get them arrested. But as Martin had said, what did they have to lose? "We'll move in today," Ruth said suddenly, her voice firm with decision, "before I lose my nerve." They drove the Buick as close to the building as possible, then began the slow process of unloading their meager possessions. 4 duffel bags of clothes, 2 boxes of essentials, Martin's tools from his factory days, Ruth's sewing kit, their medications, a few books, a camping stove, canned goods, blankets, a photograph of their children from 20 years ago, back when the kids still loved them. By nightfall, they'd transformed the main room from abandoned ruin to livable space. Ruth had swept decades of debris from the floor and hung old sheets over the windows for privacy. Martin had cleared the fireplace and built their first fire using dried wood from the shed and newspaper they'd saved. The flames caught slowly, then roared to life, sending warmth flooding through the room. They sat close to the fire that first night, huddled under blankets, eating canned soup heated on their camping stove. The soup was thin and bland, but it was warm, and they were inside, protected from the wind that howled through the trees outside. "It's not the Ritz," Martin said with a small smile. "It's ours," Ruth replied, "at least for now." The first week was brutal. The reality of living in a building with no electricity, no running water, and minimal protection from the elements set in fast. They woke each morning to temperatures in the 40s, their breath visible in the air. The fire would have died during the night, and it took precious time and energy to rebuild it. Their joints ached from sleeping on the hard floor, even with blankets layered beneath them. But they were resourceful. They'd survived the Depression's children, people who knew how to make do with nothing. Martin spent his days patching the roof, climbing up on the sagging ladder they'd found in the shed, despite Ruth's protests about his age and his knees. He used salvaged wood and tarp to cover the holes, working slowly and carefully. His hands remembered skills from 50 years ago, from building the deck on their first house, from helping his own father repair barns in rural Oregon. Ruth focused on making the interior livable. She scrubbed the floors with water from the rain barrel and soap they'd bought in town. She fashioned curtains from old sheets, using her sewing skills to create some sense of privacy and warmth. She set mousetraps with methodical efficiency, catching 3 mice the first day and feeling a grim satisfaction with each snap. The mice were just trying to survive, same as them, but this was their territory now. Water was their biggest challenge. The hand pump outside turned out to be functional, connected to an old well that still held clean groundwater. But the pump required strength Ruth didn't have. So Martin pumped every morning, filling containers they'd collected, old jugs, buckets, anything that would hold water. They bathed sparingly, heating water over the fire and washing themselves with rags, trying to maintain some standard of cleanliness. Food was the other constant concern. They went into town once a week, 14 miles each way in the Buick that burned through gas they could barely afford. They bought the cheapest staples: rice, beans, canned vegetables, oatmeal, bread when it was on sale. Martin had found an old fishing rod in the shed and managed to catch trout from a nearby stream, supplementing their diet with fresh protein when he got lucky. Small victories kept them going. The day Martin got the roof patched and they went through their first rainstorm without water dripping on their heads, Ruth actually smiled, the first real smile he'd seen in months. The day they found a box of old books in the shed, water-damaged but readable, gave them something to do in the long evenings besides worry. The day Ruth's cough finally started to improve in the drier indoor air felt like a miracle. They established routines because routines gave structure to survival. Martin woke first each morning, rebuilt the fire, and pumped water while Ruth made breakfast. They spent mornings on maintenance. There was always something that needed fixing, cleaning, or reinforcing. Afternoons were for gathering firewood, which meant walking the forest with a rusted saw, cutting fallen branches and dragging them back to the shed to dry. Evenings were for reading by firelight or simply sitting together, watching flames dance and pretending they weren't afraid of tomorrow. But there were strange things about the station, things that didn't quite make sense. Martin noticed it first while repairing a wall section near the fireplace. The timber wasn't just structural, it was doubled, with a gap between layers. When he tapped the wall, it sounded hollow in places it shouldn't. He found ventilation grills built into the floor near the baseboards, suggesting airflow to spaces below. And the building itself, when he paced it out, seemed smaller on the inside than the footprint suggested it should be. Then there was the floor in the far corner of the main room. It was Ruth who first noticed the seam. She'd been scrubbing dirt from the floorboards when her brush caught on something. She cleared away more debris and found it, a line in the wood, almost invisible but definitely there. She called Martin over. Together they cleared the area, pulling away years of accumulated grime and the ratty piece of carpet that had been covering it. The outline became clear. A hatch, maybe 3 feet by 3 feet, perfectly fitted into the surrounding boards. And it wasn't just wood, there was metal reinforcement around the edges, industrial grade. Martin ran his fingers along the seam, finding the recessed handle and keyhole. He tried lifting it. The hatch didn't budge. He examined the locking mechanism, 3 heavy bolts, each as thick as his thumb, and a keyhole that suggested a serious lock. "What is this?" Ruth asked, kneeling beside him. I don't know. Root cellar, maybe. Storm shelter. But even as he said it, Martin knew it didn't make sense. The construction was too heavy, too deliberate. This wasn't a simple storage hatch. He tried the bolts, pulling with all his strength. They were locked tight, frozen either by rust or by design. The keyhole was definitely operational. When he peered into it with his flashlight, he could see the mechanism inside, surprisingly free of corrosion. "Should we try to open it?" Ruth asked. Martin sat back on his heels, thinking. Part of him was intensely curious. But another part, the part that had learned caution from a lifetime of disappointments, whispered warnings. This hatch had been locked for a reason. Whatever was down there had been secured, hidden, sealed away. "Let's leave it for now," he said finally. "We don't have the key, and I don't want to break anything. For all we know, it's structurally important." But he couldn't stop thinking about it. Late at night, lying next to Ruth under their grandmother's quilt, listening to her breathe and the fire crackle, he stared at the ceiling and wondered what was beneath their feet. Storage? Utilities? Something else entirely? The mystery deepened 3 weeks after they'd moved in. Martin was outside splitting firewood, working his way through a pile of fallen branches he'd dragged back that morning. The physical labor felt good despite his age, keeping his muscles from atrophying, giving him purpose. He'd stripped down to just his flannel shirt despite the cold, working up a sweat that felt almost healthy. That's when he heard the engine. His heart dropped into his stomach. This was it. They'd been discovered. They were about to be evicted, arrested, thrown back into the car, or worse. He set down the axe and waited, trying to control his breathing, trying to prepare for whatever came next. A green Forest Service pickup truck navigated the narrow track and rolled into the clearing. Martin's pulse hammered in his ears. The truck stopped, and a man stepped out. He was maybe 55, 60, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. He wore the standard Forest Service uniform, tan shirt, green pants, wide-brimmed hat. His name tag read Dawson. "Morning," the ranger called out, his voice neutral, professional. "Morning," Martin replied, standing straight despite his exhaustion, trying to project dignity he didn't feel. Ranger Dawson looked around the clearing, taking in the repaired roof, the neatly stacked firewood, the smoke curling from the chimney, the old Buick parked under a tarp Martin had rigged to protect it from the weather. His eyes were sharp, missing nothing. "You folks living here?" he asked. There was no point in lying. "Yes, sir." The ranger nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd already suspected. He walked closer, and Martin could see the calculation in his eyes, the assessment being made. Dawson looked at the building, then at Martin, then toward the window where Ruth's face appeared, worry etched in every line. "How long?" Dawson asked. "About 3 weeks now, sir. You know this is federal land, right? This station's been decommissioned for 25 years. No one's supposed to be here." "I know," Martin said quietly. "We're not trying to cause trouble, sir. We had nowhere else to go." There was a long silence. Martin could hear his own heartbeat, could feel the weight of potential disaster pressing down on them. If Dawson called this in, if he forced them to leave, they'd be back in the car, back to slowly dying in parking lots. Ranger Dawson studied Martin for a long moment, taking in the man's age, his worn clothes, his work-roughened hands. Then his gaze flicked back to the cabin, to the careful repairs, the obvious effort to preserve rather than destroy. "You fixing the place up?" Dawson asked. "Yes, sir. Patched the roof, cleaned it out. We're not damaging anything, just trying to keep it from falling apart." Another long silence. Then Dawson let out a slow breath, as if making a decision he knew he shouldn't make. "I'm not supposed to know you're here," he said carefully. "You understand what I'm saying?" Martin blinked, not quite believing what he was hearing. I'm not sure." "This station's been off the books for a long time," Dawson continued. "No one checks on it, no one cares about it. Far as I'm concerned, if someone wants to keep it from falling apart completely, that's good stewardship. Conservation. He looked Martin directly in the eye. But if someone higher up finds out, if you cause problems, if there are complaints, I can't protect you. Clear? Crystal clear, sir, Martin said quickly. We won't cause any problems, I swear. You won't even know we're here. Dawson nodded. Stay out of sight. Don't draw attention. Keep the place maintained. He turned toward his truck, then paused. That old station, he said, his voice dropping lower. It's got history. Strange history. Bureau doesn't like talking about it. I'd be careful poking around too much, especially down below. Martin's breath caught. Down below? But Ranger Dawson was already climbing into his truck. Just be careful, he called out as he started the engine. And stay warm. Winter's coming early this year. He drove away, leaving Martin standing in the clearing with more questions than answers. Ruth came outside, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. What did he mean, she asked. Down below? Martin looked back at the cabin, at the building that had given them shelter and maybe, just maybe, would give them something more. I don't know, he said. But I think we need to find out. That night, after their simple dinner of beans and rice, Martin and Ruth sat by the fire and took stock of their situation. They'd been at the ranger station for 3 weeks and 5 days. They had shelter, they had heat, they had water. Ruth's cough had improved dramatically in the dry indoor air. Martin's hands had stopped shaking as badly, now that he was eating regularly and sleeping horizontal instead of cramped in a car seat. They'd survived. Against all odds, they'd found a way to survive. But the mystery beneath their feet had grown from curiosity to obsession. Martin pulled out a box he'd discovered in the smaller room during their first week. A dusty cardboard box filled with old papers he'd barely glanced at before. Now he spread the contents on the floor near the fireplace. Maintenance logs from the 1960s, supply requisitions, personnel schedules, and beneath those, folded carefully, blueprints. Martin unfolded them gently, the paper threatening to tear along the creases. Ruth leaned over his shoulder as they examined the technical drawing by firelight. It was the ranger station, no question. But the structure shown on the blueprint was much larger than what they could see. There were rooms marked that didn't exist above ground. Corridors. What looked like multiple levels. And there, in the corner of the main room, exactly where they'd found the hatch, was a marking. Secure access, Level 1. Level 1, which meant there was more below. Ruth's finger traced the lines on the blueprint. What were they doing out here, Martin? I don't know, he said honestly. But I think we need to find out. And I think we need to find the key to that hatch. They sat in silence, watching the fire burn low, both understanding that they'd stumbled onto something bigger than just an abandoned building. The ranger station had secrets, and those secrets were calling to them from beneath the floorboards. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the newly repaired windows. Winter was indeed coming, just as Ranger Dawson had warned. But for the first time in months, Martin and Ruth weren't afraid of it. They had shelter. They had each other. And they had a mystery that made them feel alive again, that gave them purpose beyond simple survival. Tomorrow, Martin decided he'd start searching for the key. Tomorrow they'd begin to uncover what lay hidden beneath their feet. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, they were just 2 elderly people who'd lost everything and found, in the middle of nowhere, a place that felt almost like home. Winter arrived in the Oregon mountains with a vengeance that took even the old-timers by surprise. Snow came in November, earlier than usual, piling against the cabin walls in drifts that reached the windows. The temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the glass each night, creating crystalline patterns that would have been beautiful if they weren't so terrifying. But Martin and Ruth Crawford had prepared. They'd stockpiled firewood until the shed could hold no more, stacking the overflow under tarps along the north wall. They'd insulated every gap they could find with old fabric and newspaper. They'd learned to layer their clothing like Arctic explorers, to sleep close to the fire, to conserve their movements to preserve energy and warmth. The cabin was warmer than the car had ever been. It was safety. It was survival. And slowly, day by day, it was becoming something more. It was becoming home. 3 months had passed since they'd first pushed open that sagging door and stepped into their new life. 3 months of hard work that had transformed both the building and themselves. The roof no longer leaked. Martin had patched every hole, replaced the worst shingles with salvaged wood, and reinforced the structure until it could handle the weight of heavy snow. The windows were sealed tight, the gaps stuffed with rags and covered with plastic sheeting they'd bought in town. The fireplace, once choked with debris, now drew perfectly, sending heat throughout the main room with remarkable efficiency. Ruth had created what could almost be called comfort. She'd sewn cushions from old blankets, stuffed with pine needles that gave off a pleasant scent when you sat on them. She'd organized their possessions with the precision of someone who'd spent years managing a household, creating designated spaces for food, clothes, tools, and their small collection of books. She'd even fashioned a makeshift kitchen area near the camping stove, with shelves for their meager supplies and hooks for pots and utensils. But it was Martin's discoveries that had changed everything. It started with the walls. He'd been repairing a section near the fireplace where water damage had softened the wood, carefully removing damaged boards to replace them with salvaged timber. That's when he noticed something odd. The wall wasn't single layer, it was double, with a gap between the outer and inner surfaces. When he tapped it, the sound was hollow, suggesting empty space behind. Curious, he'd pried away more boards, expecting to find simple insulation or perhaps evidence of rodent nests. Instead, he found paper, lots of paper. Sheets of old newspaper had been used as insulation, stuffed between the wall layers. The dates visible on the fragments ranged from 1965 to 1969. But beneath the newspaper, wedged carefully between the studs, was something else. Rolled blueprints, protected in a waterproof sleeve that had kept them remarkably well preserved. Martin had carried them to the fire, his hands shaking, not from cold this time, but from excitement. He unrolled them carefully while Ruth watched over his shoulder. What they saw made no sense at first. The blueprints showed the ranger station, yes, but the structure depicted was far more extensive than what they'd been living in. There were rooms that didn't exist, at least not above ground. Corridors that led nowhere visible. Multiple levels indicated by cross-sections and elevation markers. "This can't be right," Ruth had said, tracing the lines with her finger. "These rooms, they're not here." "Not above ground," Martin corrected. "But look." He pointed to the cross-section view. "These are underground. The whole building continues below the surface. Maybe 20 feet down, maybe more." They'd spent that evening examining every detail of the blueprints. The main room they lived in was labeled Surface Operations Center. The smaller sleeping room was marked Personnel Quarters. But below those, accessible through the hatch they'd discovered, was an entire complex. Storage rooms, what looked like an office or communications center, a corridor system, and at the far end, something labeled simply Primary Vault, Restricted Access. The scale notation suggested the underground portion was at least twice the size of the visible structure. It wasn't just a root cellar or storm shelter. This was a facility, purpose-built and deliberately hidden. "What were they doing out here?" Ruth whispered, the same question she'd asked weeks ago, but with new urgency now that they had evidence. Martin had no answer. But he knew someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this place, to hide it in the wilderness, to seal it up and make it disappear from official records. And whatever they'd been hiding was still down there, beneath their feet. That same week, Ruth made her own discovery. She'd been working in the smaller room, the one they used for sleeping now that they'd fashioned a proper bed frame from salvaged wood and filled it with blankets. The walls in there were in worse shape than the main room, with several panels cracked and loose. Ruth had been reinforcing them when one panel came away entirely, revealing not just the hollow space behind, but something tucked into that space, a small leather-bound notebook about the size of a paperback book. She'd called for Martin immediately. They sat together on their makeshift bed, and Ruth opened the journal carefully. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the ink faded in places, but most of it was still legible. The handwriting was neat, precise, the kind of penmanship they'd taught in schools back when penmanship mattered. The first entry was dated June 14, 1967. "Second week at Station 7, Martin read aloud, still adjusting to the isolation. "The cover story is holding. Local loggers believe we're doing forest surveys, measuring tree growth and wildlife patterns. None suspect the real purpose. Cooper says that's how it needs to stay. The fewer people who know, the safer everyone remains." Ruth turned the page carefully. More entries followed, each one brief, cryptic, written by someone who clearly understood the importance of not revealing too much even in private notes. But patterns emerged as they read through the months and years documented in that journal. References to "the project" appeared frequently, always capitalized, always treated with reverence and secrecy. There were mentions of personnel rotations, scientists arriving in civilian vehicles, supply deliveries made at night by helicopter, coded references to materials and equipment. Package Alpha arrived 0300 hours, stored in primary vault per protocol. Dr. Harrison completed Phase 2 calibrations. Results exceeded expectations. One entry from September 1967 sent chills down Martin's spine. Received security briefing today. Reminder that this project officially does not exist. All personnel are to maintain cover identities at all times. If compromised, deny everything. The mission is too important to risk exposure regardless of personal consequences. "What kind of mission?" Ruth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Martin kept reading, flipping through pages, watching months turn into years in the life of whoever had kept this journal. The writer, they never gave their name, just referred to themselves in first person, had clearly been stationed at the ranger station for at least 2 years. The entries grew more detailed, more personal, revealing glimpses of a person struggling with isolation, with secrecy, with the weight of whatever they were protecting. December 1968. Another Christmas away from family. Cooper brought bourbon. We toasted to missions that can't be explained and sacrifices that can't be acknowledged. Sometimes I wonder if anyone will ever know what we did here, if it will matter. Cooper says it will matter more than we can imagine. I hope he's right. Then in March 1969, the tone changed dramatically. The entries became terse, urgent, worried. March 9, 1969. Received termination order. All personnel to withdraw by month's end. Project officially never existed. All records to be destroyed. Cooper says the money's already been moved, sealed until retrieval authorization. I asked when that would be. He laughed, not a happy laugh, and said, "Maybe never, maybe when the world ends, maybe when someone decides the truth matters more than politics. I don't like leaving it here, but orders are orders. We've done our job. Whatever happens next isn't our responsibility." The entry continued. March 23, 1969. Final day. Station sealed. Vault secured with combination known only to Cooper and command. All surface evidence removed. By tomorrow, this place will just be another forgotten ranger station in the middle of nowhere. But what we protected here? God, what we protected. I hope they never need it. I hope this was all for nothing. That was the last entry. The remaining pages were blank. Martin and Ruth sat in silence for a long time, the journal resting between them like something radioactive. The fire crackled in the next room. Snow fell outside, piling higher against the windows. And beneath their feet, sealed behind that locked hatch, something waited. Something that had been hidden for 54 years. something valuable enough, important enough, dangerous enough that an entire facility had been built to protect it. "The money's already been moved, sealed," Ruth read again from the March 9th entry. "Martin, what if there's money down there? Real money?" "Or documents," Martin said. "Government secrets, classified materials. Could be anything." But the word money hung in the air between them, because money, more than secrets or documents, would change everything. Money could buy them a real home, medical care, security, a life beyond mere survival. The hatch became Martin's obsession after that. He spent hours each day studying it, examining the locking mechanism, trying to understand how it worked. The 3 heavy bolts were definitely engaged, driven deep into steel receivers set in the reinforced frame. The keyhole was the weak point, if it was a weak point at all. He tried picking it with tools from the shed, watching YouTube videos at the library on lock-picking techniques. But whatever lock was in that hatch was beyond his amateur skills, military grade probably, designed not to be opened without the proper key. He searched the cabin systematically, inch by inch. He checked every hollow space, every loose board, every possible hiding place. He climbed into the cramped attic again, spending an entire afternoon sorting through ancient insulation and bat droppings. He excavated the shed, moving every tool, every piece of junk, looking for anything that might be a key or lead to one. Ruth watched his obsession grow with concern and understanding. She knew what drove him. It wasn't just curiosity, though that was part of it. It was hope. After losing everything, after months of despair and degradation, they'd stumbled onto something that might matter, something that might give their suffering meaning. The possibility that beneath their feet lay not just secrets but salvation was intoxicating. "Martin," she said one night as he sat by the hatch yet again, running his fingers over the seams like a prayer. "What if we never find the key? What if it doesn't exist anymore?" "It exists," he said, with certainty he didn't quite feel. "Someone hid it. Someone always hides a backup key. We just haven't found it yet." The weeks turned into months. Christmas came and went, celebrated with a can of soup and a shared candy bar Martin had bought in town with their last spare dollar. They didn't exchange gifts because they had nothing to give except their presence, their partnership, their shared determination to survive. New Year's arrived with temperatures so cold that the water in their containers froze overnight despite being inside near the fire. But they endured, and Martin kept searching. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The storm hit on a Tuesday in mid-February, the kind of storm that old-timers would talk about for decades. The Weather Service had issued warnings, but Martin and Ruth didn't have a radio or phone to receive them. The first they knew was when the wind began to scream through the trees with such force that even inside the cabin they could feel the structure shudder. Snow came horizontally, driven by winds that must have been 50 miles per hour or more. The temperature plunged to near zero. The world outside became a whiteout, visibility reduced to nothing. Martin had ventured out once to bring in more firewood and nearly lost his way back to the cabin in the 20 feet between the shed and the door. They huddled by the fireplace, burning wood faster than Martin liked, but they had no choice. The cold was a living thing, pressing against their walls, seeking entry through every microscopic gap. Ruth wrapped herself in every blanket they owned, her teeth chattering despite the fire. Martin kept feeding the flames, watching their precious woodpile diminish with each hour. Around midnight, they heard it. A tremendous crack, sharp as a gunshot, followed by a crash that shook the entire structure. Something massive had hit the roof. Martin grabbed his flashlight and rushed to the smallest sleeping room where the sound had come from. When he opened the door, cold air blasted into his face. A large branch, more like a small tree, had punched through the roof, tearing away shingles and boards, bringing a cascade of snow with it. The wind howled through the gap and more snow poured in with each gust. They were going to freeze if he didn't patch it immediately. "Get me every tarp and blanket we can spare," Martin shouted over the wind. Ruth moved quickly, gathering materials while Martin assessed the damage. The branch had buckled several floorboards near the corner of the room, pushing them upward at odd angles. He worked as fast as his 71-year-old body would allow, cutting away the damaged section of branch that protruded into the room, using tarps and spare boards to create a temporary seal over the hole. It wasn't pretty, but after 20 minutes of desperate work, he'd reduced the wind infiltration to a manageable level. They could repair it properly in the morning. But as he gathered the tools scattered across the floor, his flashlight beam caught something. The buckled floorboards near the corner had revealed the space beneath them, and there in that space, something glinted. Martin's heart began to pound. He knelt, ignoring the snow falling on his head through the gap he'd just patched, and reached into the revealed cavity. His fingers closed around something cold and metallic. He pulled it out carefully. It was a small metal box, the kind that might hold fishing tackle or spare parts. Heavy for its size. The exterior was scratched and dented but intact. No lock, just a simple latch mechanism. "Ruth," he called, his voice shaking. "Ruth, come here." She appeared in the doorway, her face pale with cold and concern. "What is it?" "I found something." He carried the box into the main room, where the firelight was stronger. Ruth followed, pulling the door shut behind them to preserve heat. They knelt together on the floor near the fire, the metal box between them. Martin's hands trembled as he unlatched it. The lid opened with a soft creak that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. Inside, protected by oilcloth wrapping, were 3 items. The first was a brass key, old and heavy, with an intricate pattern of teeth that suggested a complex lock. Martin held it up to the firelight, his breath coming fast and shallow. The key fit the description of what they'd been searching for: military grade, serious, purposeful. The second item was a folded piece of paper. Ruth unfolded it carefully, revealing a handwritten note in the same precise penmanship from the journal they'd found. The ink was still dark, well preserved by the oilcloth. She read aloud, her voice barely steady. "If you're reading this, then either I'm dead or the world has changed enough that this doesn't matter anymore. The key opens primary access to level 1. Combination to the primary vault is recorded in the logbook dated July 4, 1968, final entry. What's inside was meant for something that never happened. Emergency contingencies that, thank God, were never needed. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe the whole project was madness from the start." The note continued. "But if you're down there, if you've gotten this far, then you've earned the right to decide what comes next. Do with it what you will. Use it wisely if you use it at all. I stopped believing in the mission a long time ago, but I never stopped believing someone might need what we hid. Maybe that someone is you." Cooper. The third item in the box was a photograph, faded but clear. It showed 3 men in military uniforms standing in front of the cabin. The photo was dated July 1967. On the back, someone had written 3 names in careful script: Cooper, Harrison, Valdez, Station 7 Team. Martin and Ruth sat in stunned silence, the key heavy in Martin's palm, the note's words echoing in their minds. They had it. After months of searching, of obsessing, of hoping, they finally had the key that would unlock what lay beneath their feet. "We could open it," Ruth said quietly. "Right now. Tonight." Martin looked at the hatch across the room, then at the key in his hand, then at his wife's face, weathered and thin but still beautiful to him. "Should we?" he asked. "Ruth, whatever's down there, it was classified. Secret. People went to enormous lengths to hide it. Are we sure we want to know?" "What choice do we have?" Ruth countered. "We're living in an abandoned building in the middle of winter. We're squatters on federal land. We have $43 to our names. If there's something down there that could help us, that could give us a chance at a real life again. Martin, what do we have to lose? He wanted to argue, to list all the things that could go wrong. They could be opening Pandora's box. They could be tampering with government property. They could be getting themselves into trouble they couldn't handle. But Ruth was right. What did they have to lose that hadn't already been taken from them? Still, Martin hesitated. Old habits died hard. He'd spent his whole life being cautious, following rules, trying to do the right thing. Even when the system had failed him, even when society had abandoned them, he'd tried to maintain his integrity. "Let's sleep on it," he said finally. "One more night won't matter. We'll patch that roof properly in the morning, make sure we're secure, then we'll decide." Ruth nodded, though he could see the disappointment in her eyes. She wanted to know. She needed to know. The not knowing was its own kind of torture. But fate had other plans. 3 days later, as Martin was carrying water from the pump, he felt it. A sudden pressure in his chest, like someone had placed a heavy weight there. His left arm went numb. The bucket fell from his hands, spilling water across the frozen ground. He tried to call for Ruth, but no sound came. His knees buckled, and he went down hard onto the ice. Ruth found him 2 minutes later, collapsed near the pump, conscious but gray-faced and struggling to breathe. She'd seen enough medical emergencies during her volunteer work to recognize the signs. Heart attack, possibly mild but definitely real. She half-carried, half-dragged him back to the cabin, her own heart racing with terror. They had no phone, no way to call for help. The nearest hospital was over an hour away even in good conditions, and the roads were still iced over from recent storms. By the time she got him into the truck and navigated those roads, it might be too late. She laid him near the fire, propped up on blankets and cushions, and did the only thing she could. She stayed with him, monitored his breathing, and prayed. Martin's color slowly improved. His breathing steadied. The pressure in his chest eased to a dull ache. After an hour, he could speak again. "I'm okay," he whispered, though they both knew that wasn't quite true. "You need a hospital," Ruth said, her voice breaking. "You need real medical care." "We can't afford it," Martin replied, the brutal truth hanging between them. "Ruth, one ambulance ride would bankrupt us. Emergency room treatment would put us right back where we started, homeless and drowning in debt." She wanted to argue, but she couldn't. He was right. They'd survived cancer bills once. They wouldn't survive another medical bankruptcy. So she did what she'd always done. She adapted. She kept him warm, kept him hydrated, watched for any signs of deterioration. But that night, as Martin drifted in and out of fitful sleep, something changed in him. He kept thinking about the note they'd found. "If you're reading this, then either I'm dead or the world has changed enough that this doesn't matter anymore." He'd almost died today. At 71, after months of hardship and poor nutrition and constant stress, his body was failing. What if he had another heart attack? What if next time Ruth couldn't save him? What if he died here in this cabin, never knowing what lay beneath the floor they'd been living on for months? When Ruth checked on him around midnight, he was awake, staring at the ceiling. "I want to open it," he said quietly. She understood immediately. "Martin, I almost died today," he interrupted. "I'm 71 years old with a bad heart, living on the edge of survival. I might not have much time left, and I don't want to die wondering. I want to know what's down there. I need to know." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Tomorrow," she said. "If you're strong enough tomorrow, we'll open it." "Tonight," Martin said, struggling to sit up. "Help me up. I want to do it tonight." "Martin, you just had a heart attack." "Which is exactly why we need to do this now." His voice was firm with an intensity she hadn't heard in months. "Ruth, we've spent our whole lives putting things off, waiting for the right time, playing it safe. And where did it get us? We lost everything anyway. I'm done waiting. I'm done being careful. I want to know what's down there, and I want to know tonight. She searched his face, seeing the determination there, the spark of life that had been dimmed for so long. Maybe this was what he needed. Maybe this sense of purpose, of moving towards something instead of just away from death, would be better medicine than rest. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's do it." They moved slowly, Martin still weak but improving with each minute of activity. He retrieved the brass key from where they'd hidden it under their mattress. Together, they cleared the debris that had accumulated around the hatch over the months. Old blankets they'd been using as extra floor covering, a box of supplies, the ratty carpet piece they'd never gotten around to throwing away. The hatch stared up at them, its metal reinforcement gleaming dully in the firelight. Martin knelt beside it, key in hand, Ruth kneeling next to him. For a moment, they just looked at it, understanding that this was a threshold. Once they crossed it, there would be no going back. "Last chance to change your mind," Ruth said softly. Martin shook his head. "I've never been more certain of anything." He inserted the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting all these decades for this exact moment. He turned it. Deep within the mechanism, something heavy shifted with a satisfying click that echoed through the floor. The sound was final, definitive, like a door closing on their old life and opening on something new. Martin gripped the recessed handle and pulled. The hatch resisted at first, held by decades of stillness and settled weight. But he was motivated by more than curiosity now. He was motivated by survival, by hope, by the need to believe that their suffering might lead to something meaningful. He pulled harder, and the hinges finally gave way. The hatch swung open, revealing darkness below. A steel ladder, rungs slightly rusted but intact, descended into that darkness. Cold air rushed up from the opening, but it wasn't musty or stale. It was dry, preserved, almost clinical, the smell of a space that had been sealed tight against time. Martin positioned his flashlight and shone it down. The beam revealed the ladder descending at least 20 feet, maybe more, disappearing into concrete walls. At the bottom, he could just make out what looked like a corridor or chamber. He looked at Ruth. She looked at him. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. They'd made their decision. Martin went first, testing each rung before putting his full weight on it. His chest still ached from the heart attack, but adrenaline pushed him forward. Ruth followed close behind, her movements careful but determined. They descended into the darkness together, leaving the firelit cabin behind, leaving the surface world behind, descending into a secret that had been buried for more than 50 years. The ladder was longer than the flashlight beam had suggested. Martin counted rungs as he climbed down. 10, 15, 20, 25. They were going deep, far below the frost line, down to where the earth stayed a constant temperature year-round. Finally, his boots touched solid ground. He stepped aside to let Ruth descend the last few rungs, then played his flashlight around the space. They were standing in a concrete corridor, maybe 8 feet wide and 10 feet high. The walls were painted institutional gray, though the paint had yellowed with age. Metal reinforcement ribs ran along the ceiling at regular intervals. Exposed conduits and pipes followed the walls, labeled with faded stencils. Ventilation, emergency power, communications. The corridor extended in both directions, disappearing into darkness. To their left, they could make out multiple doors. To their right, the corridor ended at something massive, a steel door unlike anything they'd seen outside of movies. It was at least 8 feet tall and just as wide, constructed of thick steel plates with visible locking bolts around the edges. In the center was a large circular wheel, like something on a bank vault or a submarine bulkhead. But it was the markings on the door that made Martin's blood run cold. Stenciled in faded yellow paint. Primary vault. Authorized personnel only. Restricted access. Level Omega clearance required. Warning. Unauthorized entry punishable under Section 793 of Title 18 of the United States Code. Below those official warnings, someone had added something else in hand-painted letters. Operation Safeguard, Final Repository, March 1969. Martin and Ruth stood side by side, staring at that massive door, their flashlight beams dancing across its surface. The air down here was remarkably dry, temperature controlled somehow despite decades without power. The silence was absolute, broken only by their breathing and the distant drip of water from somewhere in the complex. "My God," Ruth whispered. "This isn't just a hiding place. This is a government facility. A real one." Martin approached the vault door slowly, reverently. He ran his hands over the cold steel, feeling the precision engineering, the military-grade construction. This wasn't built to keep out curious animals or casual trespassers. This was built to withstand anything short of a nuclear blast. The wheel lock had a combination mechanism built into its center, a ring with numbers from 0 to 49 etched around its circumference. To open the door, you'd need to know the exact sequence. The note they'd found had mentioned a logbook with the combination, dated July 4, 1968. They hadn't found a logbook yet. Martin examined the other doors in the corridor. They were standard steel doors, nowhere near as secure as the vault, with simple handle locks. He tried the first one. It opened easily, revealing what had clearly been a storage room. Empty now, just bare shelves and concrete floor. The second door, another storage room, equally empty. The third door was labeled Administration. Martin pushed it open and swept his flashlight across the interior. A metal desk sat against one wall. Filing cabinets lined another. A corkboard still hung on the wall, empty of whatever notices or schedules it had once held. Ruth opened the desk drawers one by one. Most were empty, cleaned out when the facility was decommissioned. But the bottom drawer, hidden behind a false panel that Ruth's clever fingers discovered, contained a waterproof case. Inside the case, a leather logbook. Martin's hands shook as he opened it. The entries were brief, bureaucratic, dated. June 3, 1967. Received shipment Alpha, stored per protocol. August 12, 1967. Security sweep completed. No breaches detected. November 22, 1967. Personnel rotation. Harrison out, Valdez in. He flipped forward, looking for July 4, 1968. There it was, the final entry in the logbook. But it wasn't text. It was a series of numbers, written carefully in ink that had remained dark over the decades. 32, 16, 8, 41, 23, 9. 6 numbers. The combination. Martin looked at Ruth. She looked back at him. Both of them were breathing fast, hearts racing. They'd come this far. They'd found the key, descended into the darkness, located the combination. There was only one step left. "Do we open it?" Ruth asked, her voice barely audible. Martin thought about the medical bills that had destroyed them. He thought about living in a car, about Ruth's cough that had almost turned fatal, about the daughter who couldn't be bothered, and the son who'd disappeared. He thought about dying on the frozen ground that morning, alone except for Ruth, forgotten by a world that had used them up and thrown them away. "Yes," he said. "We open it." They returned to the vault door together. Martin positioned himself in front of the combination wheel. Ruth stood beside him, holding the flashlight steady. He took a deep breath, then began to turn. Right to 32. The wheel moved smoothly, precisely engineered. A soft click as it locked into position. Left to 16. Another click. Right to 8. Click. Left to 41. Click. Right to 23. Click. Left to 9. Final click. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, deep within the door, something released. A sound like a held breath finally exhaled. The locking bolts retracted with solid mechanical thunks, one after another, unsealing a vault that had been closed for 54 years. Martin gripped the central wheel with both hands. It was heavy, requiring real effort to turn. He rotated it counterclockwise, feeling massive internal mechanisms moving, doing what they were designed to do despite decades of disuse. The wheel completed its rotation. Martin pulled. The vault doors swung open on perfectly balanced hinges, revealing darkness beyond. But as their flashlight beams penetrated that darkness, as they stepped forward and saw what had been hidden all these years, Martin Crawford's knees nearly gave out for the second time that day. The vault was enormous, at least 30 feet by 40 feet, with a ceiling that rose 12 feet high. And it was filled, absolutely filled with money. Not loose bills scattered carelessly, not random cash in bags, but pallets. Dozens of industrial pallets stacked with shrink-wrapped bundles of United States currency. Each bundle was neatly banded, labeled, and sealed. Even from the doorway they could see the green of $100 bills, repeated across thousands upon thousands of bundles. Ruth made a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Her legs gave out, and she sat down hard on the concrete floor, her flashlight beam dancing crazily across the impossible sight before them. Martin walked forward like a man in a dream. He approached the nearest pallet and picked up one bundle with trembling hands. The label, printed in official-looking text, read, "Federal Reserve Note, $100 denomination, bundle of 100 bills, $10,000 total value." $10,000 in one bundle. He looked at the pallet. It held what appeared to be hundreds of these bundles, stacked in neat rows, wrapped in industrial plastic. He counted quickly, maybe 200 bundles per pallet. $2 million per pallet. He counted the pallets visible in his flashlight beam. 15, 20, more in the shadows beyond. Against the far wall, partially hidden by the pallets, was a metal desk with a filing cabinet beside it. Martin forced himself to look away from the money and investigate. Inside the filing cabinet were documents, meticulously organized, stamped top secret in faded red ink. He pulled out the top file and began to read. Ruth joined him, having recovered enough to stand, though she kept one hand on his arm for support. The documents told a story. Operation Safeguard, established in 1967 at the height of Cold War tensions. An emergency contingency fund, accumulated from classified budgets and covert operation surpluses. The money was meant to finance immediate intelligence operations in case of catastrophic government disruption, nuclear war, Soviet invasion, complete governmental collapse. It was to be distributed to field operatives to maintain resistance networks, pay informants, fund black operations that might mean the difference between national survival and total defeat. But the catastrophe never came. The missiles never flew. The Cold War cooled and eventually ended. And the money, already hidden and off the books, was simply forgotten. Or perhaps deliberately left buried, too complicated and compromising to retrieve. Martin found the inventory sheet. His vision blurred as he read the final line. Total value of stored assets, $245,600,000. $245,600,000. He read it again, then a third time. The numbers didn't change. He walked back to Ruth, showed her the paper. She stared at it blankly, her mind unable to process numbers that large, wealth that vast. They stood in silence, surrounded by more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes, more money than their entire hometown was worth. Martin thought about the $43 in his pocket. He thought about the station wagon worth maybe $300 if they could find a buyer. He thought about their combined monthly Social Security income of $1,800 that had once seemed like enough. And now they were standing in front of $245 million that, technically, belonged to a government that had forgotten it existed. "This isn't real," Ruth finally said, her voice hollow. "This can't be real." But it was. Martin walked back to the pallets and carefully opened one bundle. The bills inside were crisp, perfectly preserved by the dry underground environment. Benjamin Franklin's stern face stared up at him from a $100 note that looked like it had been printed yesterday, though it was dated 1963. Real. It was all terrifyingly, impossibly real. and Martin and Ruth Crawford, two elderly people who'd lost everything, who'd been sleeping in a car just months ago, who'd come here to die with dignity if they couldn't live with it, now held the key to a vault that could change everything, if they had the courage to claim it. Martin Crawford stood in the center of a vault containing $245 million and felt, for the first time in months, absolutely terrified. Not the slow, grinding fear of homelessness or the sharp panic of a heart attack, but something deeper and more paralyzing. The fear that comes from holding something so far beyond your understanding that you know with absolute certainty it will destroy you one way or another. His hands shook as he set down the bundle of $100 bills he'd been holding. The money felt radioactive, contaminated by secrets and power and consequences he couldn't begin to imagine. Ruth sat on the concrete floor a few feet away, her back against one of the pallets, staring at nothing. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. She looked like someone who'd just witnessed a car accident, shocked, disconnected, unable to process what her eyes were telling her. "We need to leave," Martin said suddenly. His voice echoed in the vault, bouncing off concrete walls and stacks of currency. "We need to go back upstairs, lock this place up, and pretend we never found it." Ruth looked at him like he'd suggested they sprout wings and fly. "Pretend? Martin, we know it's here. We know what this is. How do we just pretend?" "The same way the government did," Martin said, his voice rising with something like hysteria. "The same way they've been pretending for 54 years. We seal the vault, we throw away the key, and we never speak of it again." "And then what?" Ruth asked quietly. "We keep living in that cabin? Keep scraping by on Social Security? Wait for you to have another heart attack, this time with no way to pay for treatment?" She stood up slowly, joints creaking. "Martin, there's enough money here to save us. Enough to actually live again, not just survive." "It's not our money," Martin said, but even as he spoke, the words felt hollow. Whose money was it? The government that had abandoned them? The taxpayers who'd looked away while elderly people froze in parking lots? The system that had drained their life savings to pay for cancer treatment and then offered nothing in return? "It's nobody's money," Ruth countered. "It's been sitting here for over half a century. The operation it was meant for never happened. The people who hid it are probably all dead. The government doesn't even know it exists anymore." She walked to the nearest pallet and placed her hand on the shrink-wrapped bundles. "This money has no purpose. It's doing nothing. It's helping no one." "Except us," Martin said. "Except us," Ruth agreed. "Is that so wrong?" Martin couldn't answer. His entire life had been built on doing the right thing, following the rules, earning what you got through honest work. He'd paid his taxes, raised his children, worked 34 years at the same factory. And where had it gotten him? Living like a squatter in a condemned building, nearly dying alone on frozen ground because he couldn't afford a hospital. He looked around the vault again, really seeing it this time. The pallets were industrial grade, designed to handle massive weight. The bundles were vacuum sealed, professionally packaged. Every detail spoke of careful planning, of resources spent without question because the stakes had been existential. During the Cold War, when nuclear annihilation felt imminent, someone had decided that $245 million was a reasonable insurance policy, and then they'd forgotten about it. "How much would we take?" Martin asked, and even as he said it, he knew he'd crossed some invisible line. He wasn't debating whether to take any. He was negotiating with himself about how much. Ruth's eyes sharpened with something that looked like hope. "Enough to live," she said. "Enough to get an apartment, to pay for medical care, to eat real food. Not millions, Martin. Just enough." 50,000? Martin suggested. "That's less than a rounding error in 245 million. Ruth nodded quickly, eagerly. 50,000. We take it carefully from different pallets so it's not obvious. We lock everything back up. We're careful about how we spend it, slow and steady. No one would ever know." They stood there, two elderly people who'd spent their lives being honest and cautious, planning theft from the federal government. The irony wasn't lost on Martin, but neither was the desperation. Ruth's earlier question echoed in his mind. And then what? If they walked away from this, what future did they have? Another few months in the cabin before Martin's heart gave out completely? Before Ruth's remission ended and they couldn't afford treatment? Before the cold or hunger or simple exhaustion finally won? "Okay," he said quietly. 50,000. We take it tonight." They worked quickly, driven by fear that if they stopped to think too long, they'd lose their nerve. Martin selected bundles from different pallets, spreading the removal so it wouldn't be immediately obvious. Each bundle was $10,000. He needed 5. Ruth held the flashlight while he carefully unstacked sections, removed bundles, then restacked everything to look undisturbed. The weight was surprising. $50,000 in $100 bills weighed about a pound and was roughly the size of a thick hardcover book. Martin placed the 5 bundles in his backpack with shaking hands. The pack felt heavier than it should, as if the money had its own gravity. Before they left, Martin took photographs of everything with a cheap digital camera they'd bought at a pawn shop months ago. The vault interior, the pallets, the documents explaining Operation Safeguard, the inventory sheets. He wasn't sure why, insurance maybe, or evidence, or just a way to prove to himself later that this had been real. Then they closed the vault door. Martin spun the wheel lock clockwise until the locking bolts engaged with heavy thuds. The door was sealed again, the combination known only to them. They climbed the ladder back to the surface, muscles trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Martin closed the hatch and turned the key, locking it once more. They covered it with the carpet and furniture, hiding all evidence that it had been disturbed. Only then did Martin allow himself to look at the backpack sitting innocently by the fireplace. $50,000, their survival fund, their crime. They didn't sleep that night. They sat by the fire, the backpack between them like something alive and dangerous, and didn't speak. Ruth eventually dozed off around 3 in the morning, her head on Martin's shoulder. But Martin stayed awake, watching the flames, thinking about choices and consequences, and the fact that there was no going back from this. By dawn, he'd made a decision. Not about the money, that decision was made for better or worse, but about what came next. "We need to understand what we're dealing with," he said when Ruth woke. "We need to know more about this place, about Operation Safeguard, about whether anyone's still looking for this money." Over the next week, they developed a routine built around research and paranoia. Ruth took the lead on investigating the shelter's history. She went to the library in town 3 times a week, always careful, always watching to see if anyone paid her too much attention. She used the library's computer to search newspaper archives, government databases, anything that might tell them about Station 7 and the facility hidden beneath it. What she found painted a disturbing picture. The area had been the site of significant military activity during the 1960s, though most of it was classified at the time and remained partially classified even now. There were references to forest research stations and ecological monitoring facilities, all obvious cover stories. She found budget documents showing massive expenditures to the Forest Service for the Silver Falls region during 1966 and 1967, then abrupt cuts in 1969 when the programs were completed. She discovered mentions of Operation Safeguard buried in declassified CIA documents from the Cold War era. The operation had been one of many contingency plans designed to ensure American intelligence capabilities could survive and function even after a catastrophic attack on the homeland. Dead drops, emergency caches, sleeper networks, all the paranoid infrastructure of nuclear-age thinking. But Operation Safeguard was different. It was about money. Liquid, untraceable currency that could be deployed immediately to fund operations if normal banking and government financial systems were destroyed. The documents confirmed what they'd found in the vault. The money had been accumulated from black budgets, covert operation surpluses, and funds that officially didn't exist. What Ruth couldn't find was any indication that the government knew where the money was. Operation Safeguard had been shut down in 1969, deemed unnecessary as Cold War tensions eased. The facilities had been decommissioned and funds redistributed to active programs. But the vague language and obvious gaps in the documentation suggested something else. The money had been buried so deep, hidden so well, that when the time came to retrieve it, no one could find it. Or perhaps no one had tried. Perhaps it was easier to write off $245 million as lost than to admit it had been hidden in the first place. Meanwhile, Martin focused on the practical problem: how to use the money they'd taken without getting caught. He researched cash transaction reporting requirements, learned about the Bank Secrecy Act and how deposits over $10,000 triggered federal scrutiny. He studied money laundering techniques, not to launder money but to understand what would raise red flags. The conclusion was sobering. They couldn't just deposit $50,000 into a bank account. They couldn't suddenly start paying for things with stacks of hundreds. Every large purchase, every unusual transaction would create a paper trail that could lead investigators back to them. They'd have to spend it slowly, carefully, in cash for small things: groceries, used furniture, medical supplies. It would take years to work through $50,000 at that pace. Years of looking over their shoulders, of wondering if today would be the day someone asked where an elderly couple living in a cabin got all this cash. "Maybe we made a mistake," Ruth said one evening as they tallied their expenses and calculated how long the money would last if they were extremely careful. "Maybe we should put it back." But even as she said it, they both knew they couldn't. They'd already crossed the line, already taken what wasn't theirs, already committed to this path. Putting it back wouldn't undo the crime. It would just mean they'd risked everything for nothing. The stranger arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early March. Martin was outside splitting firewood when he heard the vehicle. Not the familiar rumble of Ranger Dawson's truck. This was different, quieter, more expensive sounding. His hands froze on the axe handle. A black sedan, unmarked but official-looking, navigated the rough track and pulled into the clearing. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was maybe 60 years old, with silver-gray hair cut military short, and the kind of posture that screamed federal agent even without the suit and tie. He wore civilian clothes, khakis and a windbreaker, but everything about him was precise, controlled, official. Martin's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. They'd been discovered. Somehow, impossibly, someone knew what they'd found and what they'd taken. He thought about the backpack hidden under their mattress, about the $47,000 they had left, about Ruth inside the cabin, unaware that their world was about to end. The man approached slowly, hands visible, non-threatening. "Mr. Crawford," he called out. "Martin Crawford." "Who's asking?" Martin said, not confirming or denying his identity. "My name is James Cooper," the man said. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to arrest you. I just need to talk." He paused, then added, "I've been waiting a very long time for someone to find Station 7. The name hit Martin like a physical blow. Cooper. The same name from the journal. The same name on the photograph of the 3 men who'd run this facility. But that Cooper would be in his 80s by now if he was even alive. "You're not Cooper," Martin said. "Cooper would be an old man." "James Cooper Sr. was my father," the man said. "He died in 1998. But before he did, he told me about this place, about what's hidden here, about the money." Martin felt the world tilting beneath him. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Cooper said gently. "You opened the vault 67 hours ago. The sensors recorded it." "Sensors?" Martin's voice came out as a croak. "What sensors?" "My father installed passive monitoring equipment in the facility before it was decommissioned. Nothing active, nothing that required power. Just seismic sensors that detect vibrations from the vault door opening. They're connected to a monitoring station 20 miles from here that I've been maintaining for the past 25 years. Cooper took a step closer. Mr. Crawford, I've been waiting since 1998 for someone to find this place and open that vault. I need to know, did you take anything? Martin's mind raced. This was the moment. Confess and face prosecution, or lie and hope Cooper couldn't prove anything. He looked at the man's face, trying to read his intentions, and saw something unexpected. Not anger, not the cold determination of a federal agent about to make an arrest, something else, almost like hope? Why? Martin asked instead of answering. If you've known about this place for 25 years, why haven't you done anything? Cooper smiled sadly. Because doing something would get me killed. Can I come inside? This isn't a conversation for the open air, and your wife should hear this too. Against every instinct, Martin nodded. Ruth appeared at the cabin door, alerted by the unfamiliar voices. Her face went pale when she saw the stranger, but she held her ground. They sat around the rough wooden table Martin had built, the fire crackling behind them. Cooper declined coffee but accepted water, which he sipped while gathering his thoughts. Finally, he began. My father was CIA, recruited out of the Army in 1958. Station 7 was one of several sites established for Operation Safeguard. He was the commanding officer here from 1967 to 1969. The money you found, $245 million, was accumulated from various classified sources over those 2 years. It was meant to be emergency funding for covert operations if the Cold War turned hot. We know all this, Ruth interrupted. We found the documents. Cooper nodded. Then you also know the operation was terminated in 1969. What you don't know is why. He leaned forward. In March of 1969, my father and 2 other officers discovered something. The men who'd authorized Operation Safeguard, the ones who controlled the black budgets, they were planning to retrieve the money for themselves. They were going to shut down the operation, claim the funds had been redistributed to active programs, and then quietly transfer it all to private accounts. It would have been the biggest theft in government history. Martin felt his stomach drop. Your father tried to stop them. He tried, Cooper confirmed. He and the other 2 officers filed a formal report through proper channels. They were told to drop it or face court-martial for breaching operational security. One of them, a man named Harrison, pushed harder. He was going to go public. 2 weeks later, he died in a car accident. Cooper's voice hardened. Single vehicle collision on a straight road in clear weather. My father got the message. Ruth gripped Martin's hand under the table. So what did he do? He made a different choice, Cooper said. He sealed the vault with the money still inside and erased the location from all accessible records. He made it look like the funds had already been moved to another site. Then he falsified transfer documents showing the money going to various operations that didn't actually receive it. The corrupt officials thought they'd been outmaneuvered, that someone above them had already taken the money. My father walked away, and the secret stayed buried. For 54 years, Martin said. For 54 years, Cooper agreed. My father spent the rest of his life waiting for the truth to come out. He maintained minimal surveillance on this site, just enough to know if anyone ever found it. He wanted to know if his gamble had paid off, if someone would discover what he'd hidden and what it meant. And when we opened the vault, Ruth said slowly, you received an alert. A seismic reading, nothing fancy, just a signal that the vault door had moved for the first time since 1969. I drove here immediately, fully expecting to find federal agents or treasure hunters or demolition crews. He looked at them both. Instead, I found you. An elderly couple living in what's supposed to be an abandoned building. And I need to know, what did you find down there, and what did you do with it? The moment stretched out. Martin could feel Ruth's pulse through her hand, rapid and frightened. This was the confession, the admission that would determine everything. But something about Cooper's story, about the way he told it, made Martin believe the man wasn't there to arrest them. "We took $50,000, Martin said quietly. 5 bundles. We were homeless, living in our car. We had nothing left. We thought—" His voice broke. "We thought maybe we deserved something after everything we'd lost." He waited for Cooper's reaction. Anger, disgust, the announcement that he was under arrest. Instead, Cooper leaned back and let out a long breath that sounded almost like relief. 50,000, he repeated. "That's all?" "That's all," Ruth confirmed. "We know it's theft. We know we could go to prison, but we were desperate." Cooper was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something completely unexpected. He laughed, not cruelly, but with genuine amazement. $50,000, he said again. "Do you understand how much money is in that vault? You could have taken millions, could have filled a truck and driven away. Instead, you took $50,000 because you were desperate." He shook his head. "My father would have liked you." "What does that mean?" Martin asked warily. Cooper's expression turned serious. "It means I'm not here to arrest you. I'm here to offer you something. A choice that's going to change your lives one way or another." He pulled a folder from inside his windbreaker and spread documents across the table. Martin and Ruth leaned forward to look. They were photocopies. Old, faded, but still readable. Letters, memos, financial records, all from the late 1960s, and all pointing to the same conclusion. Operation Safeguard had been a front for embezzlement, and the men who'd tried to steal the money had never faced justice. "I've spent 25 years gathering evidence," Cooper said. "Everything you see here, plus more. Proof of the conspiracy, names of those involved, documentation of the cover-up. But I couldn't use it. If I went public, the people involved, or their children who've inherited their power, would destroy me. I'm not a whistleblower. I'm just a man trying to honor his father's memory." "Then why are you showing us this?" Ruth asked. Cooper looked at them both intently. "Because you're in a unique position. You legally own the land this cabin sits on, which means you have legal access to whatever's on it. You discovered the vault through legitimate exploration of property you have a right to occupy. Most importantly, you're not connected to me, to my father, or to anyone else who could be accused of having a grudge or agenda." Martin began to understand. "You want us to expose it." "I want you to have the choice," Cooper corrected. "You can keep your $50,000, seal the vault, and never tell anyone. Live out your lives quietly. I won't stop you. Or you can do something bigger. You can go public with what you found, document everything, and expose one of the longest-running cover-ups in intelligence history." "And if we do that?" Ruth asked. "What happens to us?" Cooper spread his hands. "Honestly, I don't know. Best case, you become whistleblowers. The government investigates, recovers the money, and possibly pays you a finder's fee under the False Claims Act. Worst case, they prosecute you for trespassing on federal land and tampering with government property. Most likely case, somewhere in between. Media attention, legal battles, congressional hearings. Your lives become public property for a while." "Why would we risk that?" Martin asked. "We already have what we need. $50,000 is more than we ever hoped for." "Because $50,000 will run out," Cooper said bluntly. "And then what? You're still elderly, still poor, still one medical emergency away from disaster. But if you expose this properly, if you work with the right lawyers and go through the right channels, you could potentially claim a percentage of the recovery. The False Claims Act allows up to 30% for whistleblowers. 30% of $245 million is over $70 million. The number hung in the air like something unreal. Ruth made a small sound in her throat. Martin felt dizzy. 70 million, he repeated numbly. "Split between you, me, and the legal team that would handle the case," Cooper said. "But even a fraction of that would set you up for life. Real security, not just survival. Martin looked at Ruth. She looked back at him. They were being offered a choice between safety and justice, between hiding and exposure, between $50,000 and potentially millions, but also between safety and enormous risk. "Why do you care?" Ruth asked Cooper. "If it's not about the money for you, and I don't think it is, why does this matter so much?" Cooper's expression softened. "Because my father spent 40 years wondering if he'd done the right thing. He died not knowing if his sacrifice meant anything. I watched him carry that weight my whole life." He gathered up his documents. "I'm offering you a chance to make his choice matter, to prove that the good guys can win, even if it takes 54 years. But it's your choice. I won't force you. I won't expose you. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it." He stood to leave, then paused at the door. "You have my number in that folder. Take your time. Think about it. But know this. If you decide to go public, I'll support you every step of the way. I'll provide every piece of evidence I have. I'll testify to what my father told me. I'll help you find lawyers who specialize in exactly this kind of case." He met Martin's eyes. "You found something that was meant to stay buried. Now you get to decide if it stays that way." After Cooper left, Martin and Ruth sat in silence for a long time. The fire burned low. Outside, the afternoon light began to fade. The folder sat on the table between them, full of secrets and choices and possibilities. $70 million, Ruth finally said. "That's not real money, that's fantasy." "So is $245 million sitting in a vault under our floor," Martin replied. "Everything about this is fantasy, or nightmare. I can't tell which." Ruth picked up the folder, rifled through the documents. "He's right about the 50,000. It'll run out, probably in 5 or 6 years if we're very careful, and then we're back where we started." "But if we go public," Martin said, "we risk everything. Prosecution, humiliation, the media treating us like criminals or con artists. We could end up worse than we started." "Or we could end up with real security," Ruth countered. "Not just money, but justice. We could expose corruption. We could make your near death mean something." Martin thought about that morning when he'd collapsed by the water pump, feeling his heart betray him, thinking this was how he'd die, forgotten and frozen. He thought about the daughter who couldn't spare a room in her big house, about the son who'd erased them from his life. He thought about living in a car, about Ruth's cancer bills, about a lifetime of playing by rules that only seemed to apply to people like them. "I'm tired of being invisible," he said quietly. "I'm tired of suffering quietly, while people who steal millions never face consequences." Ruth reached across the table and took his hand. "Then let's make some noise." They sat there as night fell. Two elderly people who'd lost everything and found, in the middle of nowhere, something worth fighting for. Not just money, though God knew they needed it, but meaning, purpose. The chance to prove that ordinary people could still matter, could still make a difference, could still demand justice even when the powerful wanted silence. Outside, the Oregon wilderness stretched dark and endless. Inside, by firelight, Martin and Ruth Crawford began planning how to expose the biggest secret they'd ever stumbled upon. And miles away, James Cooper received a text message. "We're in. Let's do this right." He smiled for the first time in years and began making calls. The lawyer's office in Portland was nothing like Martin had imagined. He'd pictured something from a movie: marble floors, mahogany desks, views of the city from glass towers. Instead, Angela Reeves worked out of a converted house in a residential neighborhood, her conference room a former dining room with mismatched chairs and law books stacked on every available surface. But the moment she started asking questions, Martin understood why James Cooper had insisted they work with her. Tell me everything, Angela said, her pen poised over a yellow legal pad. From the moment you found the cabin to right now. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small it seems. So they told her. Martin and Ruth took turns, their voices overlapping sometimes, correcting each other's details, filling in gaps. The homelessness, the cancer bills, living in the car, finding the ranger station, discovering the hatch, the journal entries, opening the vault, the $245 million stacked on pallets like some kind of surreal monument to Cold War paranoia, and the $50,000 they'd taken. Martin's voice shook when he admitted that part. Angela didn't flinch. Technically, that's theft of government property, she said matter-of-factly. But given the circumstances, the fact that you were squatting on abandoned federal land, the money was from a defunct program that officially doesn't exist, and you took a fraction of 1%. I think we can work with it. Work with it how? Ruth asked nervously. By framing you not as thieves, but as discoverers. Citizens who found evidence of government waste and corruption and are reporting it through proper whistleblower channels. Angela flipped through the documents Cooper had provided, her eyes scanning decades-old memos and financial records. The False Claims Act protects people who expose fraud against the government. If we can prove that Operation Safeguard money was misappropriated or that there was intent to steal it, you're protected. More than protected, you're entitled to compensation. James Cooper, sitting in the corner of the room, spoke up. The documents I have prove intent. My father and 2 other officers discovered that senior officials planned to pocket the money when the operation was terminated. They filed a formal complaint. 1 officer was killed. My father was threatened. They covered it up. Names, Angela said sharply. I need names. Cooper pulled out a separate folder. Walter Hayes, Deputy Director of Operations, CIA. Gerald Thornton, Assistant Secretary of Defense. Marcus Sullivan, Senate Intelligence Committee. All 3 are dead now, but Hayes's son is currently a federal judge. Thornton's daughter runs a major defense contracting firm. Sullivan's grandson is a congressman. Angela whistled softly. So we're not just exposing historical corruption, we're threatening current power structures. Exactly, Cooper said, which is why my father never went public. He knew they'd destroy him, destroy his family, make us disappear. He looked at Martin and Ruth. This is what you need to understand. If we do this, if we really commit to exposing this, people with significant resources and connections will try to stop us. Smear campaigns, legal harassment, maybe worse. Ruth's hand found Martin's under the table. Her fingers were cold but steady. We've already lost everything once, she said quietly. We're not afraid of powerful people anymore. They can't take what we don't have. Angela studied them for a long moment. Then she smiled, a fierce, almost predatory expression. All right, here's what we're going to do. We're going to file a qui tam lawsuit under the False Claims Act. That's a lawsuit on behalf of the government against parties who defrauded it. In this case, we'll allege that the original conspirators intended to defraud the government by stealing Operation Safeguard funds, and that the current government has failed to recover assets that rightfully belong to taxpayers. Will that work? Martin asked. I've won 3 major whistleblower cases, Angela said. 1 against a defense contractor, 1 against a pharmaceutical company, 1 against the VA. I know how to navigate these waters. But I need you to understand, this will be a marathon, not a sprint, 18 months minimum, possibly years, and it's going to get ugly. She wasn't wrong. The ugliness started less than a week after they filed the lawsuit under seal, which meant the details were supposed to be confidential while the government investigated. Somehow, though, word leaked. Martin suspected the leak was deliberate, designed to get ahead of the story and control the narrative. The first article appeared in a conservative news website known for attacking whistleblowers. Homeless squatters claim they found secret government money, demand millions. The piece was brutal, painting Martin and Ruth as con artists, implying they'd fabricated the whole story to extort the government, questioning their mental stability, and suggesting they were being manipulated by anti-American activists. The comments section was worse. Hundreds of people they'd never met calling them thieves, liars, parasites, saying they should be in prison, saying they deserved to be homeless. Ruth cried when she read them. Martin held her, his own eyes burning, and tried not to let the words burrow into his soul. But they did. After a lifetime of trying to do the right thing, of being invisible and uncomplaining, being called a fraud and a thief in such a public way felt like being flayed alive. "Don't read the comments," Angela advised when they called her. "Never read the comments. Focus on the people who matter." The people who mattered started showing up a few days later. First, it was Ranger Dawson, who drove up to the cabin and stood on the porch with his hat in his hands. "I just wanted you to know," he said. "I think you're doing the right thing. Whatever happens, you've got my support." Then it was people from town. The librarian who'd helped Ruth with her research, the clerk at the grocery store where they bought their meager supplies, the owner of the diner where they sometimes got coffee. One by one, people who'd seen them struggling, who'd watched them try to maintain dignity in impossible circumstances, came forward. "We know you're not con artists," the diner owner said, pressing a casserole into Ruth's hands. "We know you're just people who got dealt a bad hand and found a way to fight back." A local church organized a community meeting. 50 people showed up, small-town folks, mostly elderly themselves, many of them one medical bill or layoff away from the same fate Martin and Ruth had suffered. They voted unanimously to support the couple, started a legal defense fund, wrote letters to their congressional representatives. "You're giving voice to all of us who've been forgotten," an old woman told Martin. She was maybe 80, thin and weathered, and she gripped his hand with surprising strength. "Don't you dare give up." The media attention intensified when Cooper went public with his father's story. He gave interviews explaining Operation Safeguard, the attempted theft, the cover-up. He provided documents, dates, names. He was calm, precise, unshakable, everything a credible witness should be. Suddenly, the narrative shifted. This wasn't just homeless people making wild claims. This was the son of a CIA officer exposing corruption his father had died trying to fight. Major newspapers picked up the story. Cable news devoted segments to it. Investigative journalists started digging into the names Cooper had provided, and that's when things got dangerous. It started with threatening phone calls, anonymous voices telling Martin to drop the lawsuit, to keep his mouth shut, to take whatever money he'd already stolen and disappear. Then someone broke into Angela's office, nothing taken, but files scattered, a clear message that they were being watched. Ruth's daughter, Melissa, finally called, not to apologize or offer support, but to warn them. "Dad, people are coming to my house, asking questions about you and Mom, about your finances, your history, trying to find dirt. My neighbors are talking. This is affecting my family." "We are your family," Martin said quietly. "You know what I mean," Melissa snapped. Can't you just drop this? Take whatever settlement they offer and move on?" "We're trying to do the right thing," Martin said. "The right thing is not dragging your family through the mud on national television." She hung up before he could respond. Martin sat with the dead phone in his hand, feeling the old familiar ache of parental disappointment. But this time, it was different. This time he wasn't ashamed of himself. He was disappointed in her, in the daughter he'd raised to value comfort over justice, silence over truth. The real breakthrough came 4 months after they filed the lawsuit. The Justice Department's investigation, prompted by the Qui Tam filing, uncovered something explosive. Deep in CIA archives, investigators found a memo from March 1969 marked "Eyes Only, Destroy After Reading." Someone had ignored the destruction order. The memo, written by Walter Hayes to Gerald Thornton, detailed plans to redirect Operation Safeguard assets to secure offshore accounts and to eliminate obstacles. Language the DOJ interpreted as a clear conspiracy to commit theft and potentially murder. The memo also mentioned that the Crawford site remains the primary concern and that assets must be retrieved before termination is complete. Crawford, the same name as the county where the ranger station was located. It was the evidence that linked the conspiracy directly to the vault Martin and Ruth had found. Within days, the investigation expanded. Federal agents descended on the Oregon mountains, documenting the underground facility, cataloging the money, interviewing everyone involved. Martin and Ruth were questioned repeatedly, their story scrutinized from every angle, but the evidence supported them. The vault was real, the money was real, Operation Safeguard was real. 6 months after the initial filing, indictments came down. Not against the original conspirators, they were all dead, but against 3 current officials who'd helped cover up the scheme and had accepted bribes decades ago to stay silent. Walter Hayes' son, the federal judge, resigned before he could be impeached. Gerald Thornton's daughter lost her defense contracts after an audit revealed she'd been billing the government for non-existent work. Marcus Sullivan's grandson, the congressman, announced he wouldn't seek re-election. The dominoes were falling, and Martin and Ruth Crawford, 2 elderly people who'd been invisible a year ago, were at the center of it all. The settlement negotiations took another 8 months. The government initially offered to drop all charges against Martin and Ruth for the $50,000 they'd taken and to pay them a nominal finder's fee of $100,000. Angela laughed in the prosecutor's face. My clients exposed a 54-year-old conspiracy to steal $245 million from taxpayers, she said. They documented a cover-up that included at least 1 suspicious death. They provided evidence that led to multiple indictments. Under the False Claims Act, they're entitled to at least 15% of the recovered assets. That's $36 million. The negotiations ground on. The government argued the money had never actually been stolen, so there were no recovered assets to calculate a percentage from. Angela countered that the money had been fraudulently concealed and that Martin and Ruth's discovery had saved taxpayers from a loss they didn't even know existed. They settled on $10 million, $5 million for Martin and Ruth, $3 million for James Cooper, $2 million for Angela's firm. After taxes, Martin and Ruth would clear roughly $3 million. $3 million. Martin heard the number and felt nothing at first, just a strange numbness. Then Ruth started crying, and he started crying, and Angela was shaking their hands, and James Cooper was smiling that sad smile of his, and Martin thought, my God, we survived. We actually survived. The press conference was held on the steps of the federal courthouse in Portland on a bright autumn morning, almost exactly 2 years after Martin and Ruth first pushed open the door of that abandoned ranger station. Martin wore a suit he'd bought 2 weeks ago, the first suit he'd owned in a decade. Ruth wore a simple dress and her grandmother's pearl necklace, recovered from storage where it had sat since they lost their house. They stood at the podium with Angela on one side and James Cooper on the other. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. Martin gripped the edges of the podium and spoke into the microphone, his voice shaking but clear. My wife and I lost everything 3 years ago, he began. We lost our home, our savings, our dignity. We lived in a car for months. We thought we might die that way. Forgotten, frozen, just 2 more statistics. But we found a place that gave us shelter, and in that shelter, we found evidence of something terrible. Evidence that powerful people had tried to steal from all of us, from every taxpayer, from the very country they were supposed to serve. He paused, gathering strength. We could have stayed quiet. We could have taken what we found and disappeared. But we were raised to believe that the truth matters, that justice matters, that ordinary people, even broken, homeless, elderly people, still have a voice. Ruth stepped up beside him. We're not heroes, she said, her voice soft but steady. We're just survivors who got lucky. But if our story helps other people find the courage to speak up, to demand accountability, to believe they matter even when the world tells them they don't, then every hard moment was worth it. The press conference ended with Angela announcing that Martin and Ruth would be donating $1 million to establish the Crawford Foundation for Elderly Housing Security, a nonprofit dedicated to helping elderly Americans avoid homelessness through emergency assistance, legal support, and affordable housing advocacy. "We remember what it felt like," Martin explained to reporters afterward. "We remember the fear, the cold, the invisibility. If we can prevent even one other couple from experiencing that, the money will have been well spent." They bought a house 3 months later. Nothing extravagant, a modest 3-bedroom home on 2 acres outside Portland, with a view of the mountains and a garden where Ruth could plant vegetables. It had a working furnace, insulated walls, and a roof that didn't leak. To Martin and Ruth, it felt like a palace. They furnished it slowly, carefully, choosing each item with consideration. A comfortable bed that didn't hurt their backs. A real kitchen table where they could eat meals without balancing plates on their laps. A couch where they could sit together and watch the news or read their books. Simple things that weren't simple at all, not when you'd lived without them. Their daughter Melissa visited once, awkward and stilted, bringing the grandchildren Martin and Ruth barely knew. She apologized, sort of, in that non-apology way of people who were sorry for the consequences, but not for their actions. Martin accepted it with grace he didn't entirely feel. Some wounds healed, some just scarred over. Their son Kyle never called. They stopped waiting for him to, but they made new family. The Crawford Foundation grew quickly, funded by their donation and by other contributions that poured in once word spread. They hired a small staff, social workers, lawyers, housing advocates. They opened an emergency fund that elderly people could access within 24 hours if they faced eviction or utility shutoffs. They partnered with legal aid organizations to help seniors fight unjust medical bills. Ruth threw herself into the work with the kind of passion Martin hadn't seen in her since before the cancer. She visited shelters, talked to elderly people living in their cars, listened to stories that echoed their own. She held hands with women who cried from relief when they learned they qualified for assistance. She became the advocate she'd wished she'd had. Martin found different purpose. He started a small workshop in their barn, teaching basic carpentry and repair skills to homeless men trying to get back on their feet. He didn't charge anything. He just shared what he knew, passed on the skills his father had taught him, gave people the tools, literal and metaphorical, to rebuild their lives. "Everyone needs to know how to fix things," he told his students. "Not just machines and buildings, yourself, your life, your dignity. Sometimes you have to tear down what's broken and start over. But you can't do that if you don't have the tools." The ranger station became famous. The Forest Service, embarrassed by the revelation that a classified facility had existed on their land without their knowledge, designated it as a historical site. They preserved it carefully, restoring the structure while maintaining its character. The underground vault was sealed permanently, but the surface building was opened for tours. A plaque was installed near the entrance, "Station 7, Operation Safeguard Site, 1967 to 1969. This facility served as a covert operations center during the Cold War. In 2024, residents Martin and Ruth Crawford discovered evidence here that exposed government corruption and led to significant reforms in oversight and accountability. Their courage in speaking truth to power reminds us that ordinary citizens can make extraordinary differences. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Martin and Ruth visited on a cold morning in late fall, 3 years after they'd first broken into what they thought was just an abandoned building. They walked the path from the parking area, a real parking area now with gravel and drainage, to the cabin that had saved their lives. It looked different, clean, preserved. The roof was properly repaired. The windows were replaced with historically accurate glass. The porch no longer sagged. Tour groups walked through in organized clusters, listening to rangers explain the history of Operation Safeguard and the conspiracy that had been exposed. But when Martin looked at it, he still saw the broken-down wreck they'd found. He saw Ruth sweeping mouse droppings from the corners. He saw himself up on the roof with shaking hands, trying to patch holes before the next storm. He saw the two of them huddled by the fire, wondering if they'd survive the winter. "It's strange," Ruth said quietly, "seeing it like this, like a museum, like history." "It is history," Martin replied. "Our history. The history of everyone who's ever had to fight just to survive." They walked inside. The interior had been carefully recreated to look as it might have in 1969, with period furniture and equipment. But Martin could still see where their mattress had been, where they'd cooked on their camping stove, where they'd sat by the fire and planned their impossible gamble. The hatch was still visible in the floor, now behind a protective barrier with an explanatory plaque. Visitors could look but not touch. The vault below was sealed, its contents long since removed and returned to the treasury. But the story remained, preserved in photographs and documents and testimony. "Do you ever regret it?" a young ranger asked them. She was maybe 30, earnest, clearly honored to meet the people whose story she'd been telling to tour groups. "Opening the vault? Going public? You could have just taken the money and disappeared." Martin and Ruth looked at each other, that wordless communication of couples who'd spent a lifetime together. Then Martin turned back to the ranger. "Every path we didn't take haunts you a little," he said. "We could have walked away. We could have stayed quiet. But we'd have spent the rest of our lives wondering if we'd made the right choice. At least this way we know. We chose truth. We chose courage. And we chose to believe that ordinary people still matter." Besides, Ruth added with a small smile, the money would have run out eventually. What we have now, the foundation, the lives we've touched, the difference we've made, that's permanent. That outlasts us. They left as the afternoon light began to fade, walking slowly back to their car, their steps measured but strong. Behind them, the ranger station stood solid against the darkening sky, a monument not to secrets but to their revelation. In the car, driving back to their warm house with its working heater and full refrigerator, Martin reached over and took Ruth's hand. "We did good," he said. "We did," Ruth agreed. "We survived. We fought. We won." Not completely, of course. There would always be corrupt officials. There would always be systems that failed vulnerable people. There would always be elderly couples losing everything to medical bills and indifferent bureaucracies. Martin and Ruth hadn't fixed the world, but they'd fixed their corner of it. They'd proven that speaking up mattered, that evidence could overcome power, that two people with nothing could still change everything if they refused to stay silent. The Crawford Foundation helped 327 families in its first 2 years of operation. 327 elderly Americans who didn't have to sleep in their cars, didn't have to choose between medication and food, didn't have to feel invisible and forgotten. Each one of them a victory, each one of them proof that the fight had been worth it. Martin and Ruth Crawford lived 10 more years after exposing Operation Safeguard. 10 years of comfort, security, and purpose. 10 years of making a difference. 10 years of finally being seen and heard and valued. When Martin passed away at 83, peacefully in his sleep with Ruth holding his hand, the funeral was attended by hundreds, not just family, though their grandchildren came, and even Kyle showed up, older and sadder and full of regrets he could never quite voice, but also the people they'd helped. Elderly couples who'd been saved from eviction, veterans who'd found housing, social workers whose jobs had been made possible by foundation funding. The Crawford Foundation continued after his death with Ruth at its helm until she joined Martin 4 years later. It continues still, run by a dedicated board and funded by an endowment that will help people long after everyone who knew Martin and Ruth personally is gone. Their legacy isn't measured in dollars, though the dollars helped. It's measured in lives changed, in systems challenged, in the proof, permanent and undeniable, that courage doesn't require power or wealth or privilege. Sometimes it just requires two people who refuse to give up, who open a locked door, who insist on telling the truth even when silence would be easier. The ranger station still stands in the Oregon wilderness, preserved and protected. Every year, thousands of visitors walk through its doors, learn its secrets, and hopefully carry away the lesson that Martin and Ruth taught through their lives. Anyone can survive if they're willing to believe they're worth saving. Anyone can find fortune if they're brave enough to look in the places others fear to go. And anyone can change the world if they remember that the truth, no matter how buried, always finds a way back to the light. Because sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in vaults. They're found in the courage to keep going when everything says stop. In the willingness to do right when doing wrong would be easier. In the hands that hold yours when the world turns cold. And in the decision, made in a moment of desperate hope, to open a door that was meant to stay closed. Martin and Ruth Crawford opened that door, and in doing so, they opened possibilities for thousands of others. They proved that the forgotten could be remembered, that the powerless could find power, that justice, though delayed, could still arrive. Their story started with loss, but it ended with legacy. And that, perhaps, is the greatest treasure of all. The end. Up next, two more powerful stories that will move you. Click now to keep discovering, and hit subscribe if you believe second chances are always possible.